So a bit more about the experts group in archival description. It was formed by the International Council on Archives Program Commission in late 2012, and it really took us until about the spring of 2013 to get organized and work underway, and we've been working since then. The experts group is a partial successor to the Committee on Best Practices and Standards, which developed the 4 existing ICA description standards. The term for the experts group in archival description is 2012 to 2016, and we will be putting in a request to be reappointed because the work is incomplete and ongoing. For this term, we've been charged with developing a conceptual model for archival description based on the 4 current ICA description standards, and doing so employing formal information modeling techniques. The ICA got into the business of archival description standards beginning with discussions in 1988, and in 1992 it issued a set of principles, and then in 1994 the first edition of ICA-G was issued, revised again 5 years later. Following ICA-G was ICAR, International Standard Archival Authority Records. And then there was a big lapse in there with the exception of revising ICAR in 2004. You had the issuing of International Standard Description of Functions and International Description of Institutions with Archival Holdings in 2008. And it was around that time that it was becoming clearly apparent that the standards needed to be revisited not one at a time, but all at once. Now, the standard that the experts group is working on, we've named it Records in Context, and both of those are in the plural as a matter of emphasis. The word context is in plural, is to recognize that records over the course of their existence can and frequently do exist in more than one context. The standards are based, the standard that we're developing is fundamentally based on the principle of provenance, which has 2 facets: the respect to forms. The records created, accumulated, and used by a person or group in the course of life and work are to be kept together and not intermixed with records from other sources. And respect for original order. The intellectual grouping of and sequencing imposed on the records in the context of accumulation and use is essential to understanding the interrelations among them, as well as being evidence of how they are used. So both of these are to be respected, as the expressions have it. Now, there are general international consensus on the principle of provenance, but historical and cultural differences in understandings. And further, there's been, over the course of many years, a fair amount of both theoretical and practical criticism of the principle of provenance. And at the end of the day, most archivists are in general agreement on the importance of the principle, but that our understanding of it could be much better and fuller, that it has broader sense of understanding it that's essential, and that the traditional understanding of it is still very much relevant, but it's in a certain sense incomplete. So what we decided to do, rather than quibbling an enormous amount about defining the principle of provenance in both of its facets, was to say that what we're really about is we want to describe records in context, and that's what archival description should be fundamentally based in. And we feel that this embodies both of the facets, though our approach includes a much more expansive understanding of what provenance is. the social and material complexity of the origins and existence of records is much more complex than the traditional understanding would have it. That records and the people that create, manage, and use them do not exist in isolation, but in complex layers of interrelated and interdependent contexts. Now, I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly, but this is just laying some of the context for our work on records and context. And that is just an observation that since at least the mid-19th century, cultural heritage communities have been reimagining description and the way they go about describing the things in their care in relation to emerging and new communication technologies. The trend since the mid-19th century is as the technologies enabled it, is to separate the components of description to efficiently and more effectively create the prevailing tools. So typically, and I think we're very much in this tradition, you don't overthrow the past and do something completely new. That what we've said about doing here is to think about doing what we've been doing, but doing it in a better, more efficient, and a more effective way. And you can still have the familiar apparatus if you would like to have that, but we also at the same time open up new perspectives and new paths into describing and understanding and making records useful over time. I think the 4 ICA standards reflect the trend that I'm describing here, though what was recognized as the separation and new perspectives not realized. Of the 4 standards, really ICA-G was the only one with major uptake, and to some extent ICA-R, and very little embrace of either ISDF or ISDIA. Now, what are the new communication technologies available to us? There is, of course, the network and markup technologies, which we've all become quite familiar with, HTML and XML and the Text Encoding Initiative and EAD, etc. And database technologies, or SQL. And XML and SQL in terms of data representation have dominated over the last 15, 20 years. But the emergence of graph technologies, in particular, it's called RDF, W3C, standards and semantic technologies and linked open data have emerged and began to establish themselves. And what they represent is the ability to be much more expressive than you can be using the XML or SQL markup or database technologies. They offer the opportunity of separating these components of description, recombining them, interrelating them, opening domain borders, and connecting data between disparate systems, and doing all kinds of things that just a few years ago were completely unimaginable or were just prohibitively difficult to do for both social and technological reasons. And so it's with this technology in mind that we want to reposition the community to take advantage of the opportunities. So the 2 things that we are developing, EGAD is developing, is a conceptual model for archival description, or RiC-CM as we call it. The conceptual model, this is perhaps a bit of an overstatement, but we claim it resembles the current ICA standards, but you might have to stare at it a while to see the connection. But it's somewhat similar. And it documents the key entities of archival description and the properties of each. And yet to be developed with lots of diagrams illustrating how the components are interrelated to form complete archival description. And currently, this is, as of last Saturday, available as a complete draft, or mostly complete draft, available for comment until the end of this year. The other part of the standard is an ontology for archival description, or RiC-O. This will be based on the RiC conceptual model, but it will formalize it and express it in a machine-readable language called OWL. It will map archival descriptive concepts to similar concepts employed by allied communities. to facilitate, and you'll see this a bit in a slide that Florence will present later, integrated access to cultural heritage. Will enable archival community to participate on its own terms, and by that, with allied communities, so the library community, the museum community, each have their own conceptual models, ontologies, and they're constantly trying to get us all to be just exactly like them. They don't understand that's just absolutely impossible for us to be like them, that we have to have our own standard, we have our own principles, we have our own fundamental responsibilities. And so both RIC-CM and RIC-O will position us to be equal partners in the dialogue with respect to integrated access to cultural heritage. A draft will be available late in 2016. So the predominant form of archival description today is a hierarchical top-down description of a single phone. Description of the whole, the parts of the whole, parts of the parts. It is largely, if not exclusively, self-contained, inward-looking. That is, not connected to the broader context. It's all contained in a single apparatus. ICA-G is a model for this approach. Encoded archival description is a method for communicating it. So I'm going to repeat something that I said just a couple of slides ago, that records in context is it's taking a much more expansive understanding of provenance, and that records and the people that create, manage, and use them do not exist in isolation, but in complex layers of interrelated, interdependent contexts. Now, just a couple of major differences between ICA-G and RIC, and I'll leave more details up to my two colleagues. We've no longer using the expression unit of description in treating aggregations of records and individual records as though they're the same kind of thing, because we firmly think that they're not the same kind of thing, that each of them is to be described and described in its own way, and this is records and record sets. And there's a recognition here also that over the course of its existence, a record, or even a record set, may be a member of more than one record set, or at the same time. We've also subsumed the notion of multi-level description or hierarchical description, is it's merely one among other possible methods of description. So we're certainly not doing away with it. We strongly feel that probably for at least the near term that multi-level description will remain dominant, but we're hopeful that in time that it will become less dominant. Our alternative to it is what we're calling multi-dimensional description. I'm not sure that's the best metaphor in the world for it, but it's the one we came up with. Maybe multifaceted might also work, or multi-directional. But the idea is you're not forced to conceive of a set of records as a tree. And so we're seeing description really is within a network of describing records, within a network of interrelated records, phones, people, mandates, functions, context within context. To enable more flexible description, relational and graph, that is more expressive of the complex realities of records than possible in a single hierarchical description. Or another way of putting this, description is a vast social document network.